Pandora takes the stage.
Welcome to DW News. We interrupt our regular programming to take you live to Berlin, where Germany is hosting a second day of peace talks on Ukraine. Chancellor Merz and the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy are giving a press conference. Let's listen in.
Thank you for the good deliberations that we've had. In the last few days, we have developed a huge diplomatic dynamism, perhaps the greatest dynamism since the war began in the 24th of February 2022. We have a real opportunity for a peace process for Ukraine, but it's still just a tender plant. We need to take care of it, but it is a real opportunity. In the last weeks and days, we have worked very hard to reach and pave a way for a ceasefire. We know the price of war, and the time has come to talk about the price of peace. Questions of security guarantees, ceding territory or not, and a security mechanism to keep the peace. Yesterday and today, we have some intense discussions between Ukrainians, Americans, and Europeans. Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner, the two special envoys sent by U.S. President Trump, have played a key role in this process. I want to say that very clearly. Without their tireless efforts and without the efforts made by U.S. President Trump, we would never have generated the positive dynamism that we are experiencing in these days and hours. There are a few EU heads of state and government that I'll be welcoming in the Chancellor's office soon to discuss some of these issues. Apart from Volodymyr Zelenskyy and myself, French President and British Prime Minister will be there, but also Donald Tusk, Giorgia Meloni, Alexander Stubb, and the NATO head Mark Rutte, as well as Ms. von der Leyen will be there, and Mr. Witkoff and Kushner will be there. So this is an ambitious program. Russia is playing for time by asserting its maximum requests. At the same time, it is continuing its war against Ukraine. But we're not going to let ourselves be put off by this. We're pursuing 5 goals that we have agreed on between all of us here. After 4 years of war, we want a ceasefire that preserves the sovereignty of the Ukrainian state. And this ceasefire must be supported by substantial legal and material guarantees of both the EU and the USA. The legal and material guarantees that the US have put on the table here in Berlin is really considerable. This is huge progress, and I welcome it very much. Thirdly, we are working together on a ceasefire between Ukrainians, Americans, and the Europeans. Yesterday and today, this remains our agreement, our common understanding, and our common success. Fourthly, this ceasefire must ensure that the unity of the EU and NATO must not be infringed on. We must come together even stronger than in the past. And fifthly, the ceasefire must preserve the Ukrainian perspective and make it possible for Ukraine to rebuild. Ukrainians see that way, as do the Americans, as do the Europeans. One of the key questions remaining is which territorial regulation we could arrive at. And this is a question that only the European people can answer, and the Ukrainian president, who is defending his territory here. And let me say, it is the Ukrainian people who have fought bitterly for the last 4 years for their territory. So it must be the Ukrainians who decide on any ceding or not ceding of territory to Russia. Now, yesterday and today we've made important progress in terms of agreeing our negotiation position. In very confidential rounds, we have discussed where we stand, and we have listened closely to one another. And I very much hope this evening that we will achieve further progress and that we will close ranks between Ukraine, Europe, and the US. We want to push Moscow to stop playing for time and to work towards a ceasefire as well. So we, as Europeans, will be stepping up the pressure on Russia to this end. We are continuing to work to ensure that the frozen Russian assets in the EU are used for Ukraine. This would be an additional level of security. We've made an initial step. These assets have been immobilized on a longer term in Europe. Now, at the European Council on Thursday, we want to agree on this proposal, which I put forward. It's obviously important to say that Belgium has their own concerns, and we will have to do justice to everybody's concerns here. Germany wants to help Ukraine as one of its closest partners. The German government budget has earmarked significant sums to support Ukraine, and at the German-Ukrainian Business Forum that we both just attended, we came up with a 10-point plan for cooperating in the defense industries between Germany and Ukraine for our mutual benefit. We'll be discussing today how to strike a good balance between European aid and contracts to European companies. On this note, then, Volodymyr, I think it's the first time since the 24th of February 2022 we see a real opportunity to pave the way towards peace. We want to go down that path with you as Ukrainians, with our European neighbors, and with the United States of America. And I believe we are well on the way to getting there. We've certainly taken a significant step, and I expect further steps this evening. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much, Chancellor. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank Germany for giving me the opportunity to activate our work towards peace. These are important days where we are hopefully really making progress. I hope that you can help us to bring peace even closer to us. Germany and the German Chancellor are a huge support for us, both Ukraine and the people who live in it. And we want to live an ordinary life, and it's worth fighting for that. But unfortunately, it is the case that the Ukrainians in the 21st century have to defend their rights with weapons, their right to live in liberty in Europe in a European manner. And we are fighting, particularly within the framework of negotiations. Ukraine has a justifiable interest. We feel we are being heard, and we feel our partners are prepared to support us. Security guarantees are crucial, and we need to work on that. During the negotiations, I emphasized that security guarantees of this kind must be in place and must work, not least in the interest of Europe, but of course, first and foremost, for Ukraine. I want to thank the German Chancellor and everyone else here. I also want to thank the US-American team. We negotiated for 5 hours yesterday, and today we had a number of rounds of negotiations. They are continuing. The negotiations were very fact-based. The dialogue with the American side, with our US colleagues, is continuing. Almost around the clock, we are working at achieving a result that respects the people of Ukraine. Naturally, there are very difficult issues that we have to deal with, particularly those regarding territorial issues. It is important for all of us to work on this issue to ensure that we regulate these questions in the fairest possible manner. There are various different positions on territory, but I think it's extremely important to have an opportunity to present the Ukrainian side, which I've had. Everyone is working hard and productively to find a good result on the basis of respect for Ukraine. And Ukraine, in its turn, is prepared to continue to work in a fair and constructive manner in order to achieve a final result. We are coordinating with the German Chancellor. Thank you, Friedrich, for that. We're also coordinating with our other European partners and heads of state and government. And the bilateral plan that we had was that we take part in the German-Ukrainian Business Forum, which we did. These are our common projects, German and Ukrainian projects, and they will help us in Ukraine, and in turn that will help Germany. Our technologies and our skill sets can be shared with Germany and the other way around. It's important that we not just strengthen Ukraine, but strengthen Europe as well. And the cooperation between our countries must be structured such that in the energy industry we make progress, both sides. We're going to be pursuing an export hub in the German capital in order to bring together our findings, not least when it comes to the production of drones. Now, every day we have to defend our cities and our positions in armed conflict, and it's important that we strengthen our aircraft resilience, our air defense resilience, rather. So that's important that we continue to make progress in this area. Next year, we hope that Germany will continue to take its rational position when it comes to continuing to freeze Russian assets in Europe, and that this immobilization can be carried out on a longer term now is a very good thing. We hope this is passed. This will be an option for supporting Ukraine, not just protecting Ukraine from attacks from Russia, but also what happens in the country long term, because this war with Ukraine with Russia must come to an end, because naturally it would be fair if the country that instigated this conflict suffer the most, and that's why it's fair to freeze these Russian assets long-term in order to be able to balance them against future reparations. Glory to Ukraine. Nicola Metz from Inter. Mr. Witkov has suggested that it might well be possible to achieve serious progress. Can you give us some indications of what issues you've made progress on? And have you referred to territorial concessions or lack thereof? And then a question to Mr. Merz. Now, Italy has joined forces with Belgium and has expressed its reservations. So have Bulgaria, so has Malta, when it comes to using frozen Russian assets for Ukrainian defense. What do you think are the opportunities, and how likely is it that there will be an agreement reached on Thursday in Brussels? Well, thank you very much for the question. It was an initial meeting. It's the first meeting in the context, in this constellation, with Mr. Kushner and Mr. Witkoff, i.e. with a team from the US. Meetings like this were always carried out by our team, together with representatives of the European states, the security staff. And this team had been to Russia before. I always wanted this team to come to Ukraine, but I was perfectly willing to come here if it should not be possible for them to come to Ukraine. So we had the opportunity to meet and speak for a number of hours, and we did indeed make progress in a number of areas. I can say that the results and how they will be perceived from the aggressor side are something I cannot predict, of course, but what was important to me is that we were heard. Now, naturally, I touched on the details of this war, and I think the US colleagues heard that. Had we had a meeting earlier, we might well have achieved results earlier, but I'm still very grateful that they came here and that we were able to achieve something together and tackle some of the questions that I believe are destructive and won't really help us, are ones that I would rather not see in the next version of the documents we're negotiating on. An important question is the respect of Ukraine. The question of territory is an extremely painful issue for us. I mean, Russia has its own list of wishes. Obviously, we know exactly what they want, and we understand it, whether you believe it or not. It is the case that we know what they want. It's hardly a secret what the Russian side wants. But I believe that the position of Ukraine is very clear, without any ifs, ands, and buts. And it was very important to me that we communicate our side to the US team very clearly and very openly. And I'm very grateful that we really listened to one another. I believe that the US side, as brokers, will be suggesting a number of different steps in order to be able to reach some kind of a consensus. And in these issues, I naturally very much hope that the USA will continue its role as a mediator. That would be helpful in the future. And when it comes to rebuilding Ukraine and the financing that Ukraine will need to do that, and who has to pay for what compromises there are going to be, there certainly has to be some kind of a dialogue here and a real compromise. And we will do everything we can in order to find a very clear response in terms of security guarantees and financing, possible reparations, who has to pay for what. We'll have to understand what the sources of financing could be. Where will this money come from? And with reference to the frozen Russian assets in Europe, I do think that is a potential source. There are framework agreements that are being envisaged with reference to security guarantees, and in many different ranges we've already made progress. And I'm grateful for that. Now, with reference to the frozen Russian assets, there's one thing I'd like to say about that now. We have already made one decision, and this decision from last week is that the Russian assets will be frozen long-term in Europe, so they'll be immobilized. That means that the Russian currency bank, or the Russian central bank, and the Russian state will have no access to these assets in the long term. Now, the question of which financing we will generate from that for the future financing of Ukraine is something we're going to continue to discuss. And we'll decide on Thursday. We've got the Article 122, which allows a decision on this with a qualified majority. It is only on the basis of Article 122 of the EU Treaty that we'll be able to agree on this. And there are no other decisions that we can take except on this article. Then the use of mean funding from the pandemic time or releasing European bonds are things that require consensus, and we're not going to get this consensus within some of the EU member states. So that means we can only work with a qualified majority and take a decision on that, both in terms of the agreement and the use thereof. And that's what we'll be discussing in the EU in the near future. I understand the concerns. I do not share the concerns, take them seriously, but I very much hope that Belgium, the country most impacted on this decision, will come a step in the right direction with us. Again, it would be expedient to be able to support Ukraine so that Ukraine can defend itself moving forward. And it would send a very clear signal to Russia that we need to end this war.
Herr Bundeskanzler, Herr Zelenskyy, Jörg Blank von der dpa. Hier hinten, Herr Präsident Zelenskyy, stimmt es, dass die USA fordern, dass die Ukraine
Chancellor, Mr. Zelenskyy, I'm from the DPA. Mr. Zelenskyy, is it true that the EU are calling on Ukraine to cede territories in Donbass that have not yet been occupied by Russia? And a question to the Chancellor and to the President, both of you. When it comes to the question of security guarantees, is it conceivable that there will be NATO troops or EU troops on a front line as boots on the ground and a security guarantee? A question that many people are interested in. Will there be a ceasefire by Christmas in Ukraine? Well, we had a little bit of a technical difficulty there with the interpretation. But to respond to that question, I'd like to say that we have great respect for the U.S. delegation. I don't have a sense that the U.S. demanded something of us. I see the U.S. as a strategic partner. And so the question regarding territorial concessions to Russia, well, I mean, I'm well aware of what the Russian demands are. And obviously, I couldn't demand anything of the U.S. delegation. I merely communicated to the special envoys what our point of view is and asked them to communicate that to the Russian side. As I said, we are aware of what the Russian demands are, what their aims are, and we are making efforts to depict our position. I'm very grateful that we are being heard. And in this extremely sensitive question of territorial concessions, during the dialogue, we had a similar view on this. You have a second question, though, the question of boots on the ground on the front line as part of security guarantees and whether there will be troops present in Ukraine on the front line. Well, we're talking about security guarantees. And my question is, before we make any steps on the battlefield, we have to have a very clear awareness of what the security guarantees are going to be before we're going to do anything differently on the battlefield. We are not assuming that NATO membership is really an option. I mean, it would have been clear how NATO membership could have worked for Ukraine anyway, but from the U.S. side, we have now heard that there will be security guarantees from the U.S. that are similar to NATO's collective defense pledge, Article 5. And that's a first step. Then the question of monitoring a ceasefire. I would say this is the very foundation for security guarantees, because the question is who's going to undertake such monitoring? What sanction steps will there be if the monitoring mission is disturbed in some way and unable to do its job? The agreement that we've reached so far is that we need to address these questions, and the actual question of who's going to be on the contact line. If there's a ceasefire, will they be, soldiers from any particular country, whether there'll be technical monitoring? These are all things that would need to be discussed in a military context. And they are the professionals in this area and will be able to suggest something for negotiations. So in response to the security guarantees, Mr. Blank, I referred to this already in my previous remarks when I talked about the agreement that we have reached so far, that we would need to have substantial material guarantees from the US and from Europe. Now, this is a significant, substantial agreement that we have not had in the past. Both the Europeans and the Americans are prepared to do this, to provide these. And Mr. Zelensky referred to security guarantees resembling NATO's collective defense pledge, and I would say that is significant progress. And the U.S.-American side also expressed their commitment legally and generally to support this. Now, let me just say we're not going to be repeating the mistakes we made in the Minsk Accords. There needs to be a security guarantee to the Ukrainians to ensure such a ceasefire. And what exactly this is going to mean and how we're going to spell this out is something for the future. But as I said, both the US and the Europeans are behind these security guarantees. So there'll have to be comprehensive security guarantees that we will agree on in detail in the future. At the moment, there's no point speculating about what that might pan out as being and what it would mean for each country involved in providing these security guarantees. But if we get to that point and we achieve a ceasefire, Ukraine will have defense capabilities, not just on its own, but also the states that support it. So that's got to be good news. And this depends entirely on the Russian side. Yesterday and today, we have reached common proposals from Ukraine, US, and EU, and Europe, rather. So it's just down to Russia whether or not we manage to achieve a ceasefire by Christmas or not. I'd like to use this opportunity to say in no uncertain terms to the Russian government and the Russian president, please leave the Ukrainian people in peace over Christmas, because the bombing has continued almost without exception against hospitals, nurseries, energy infrastructure. The bombs are falling, and this is terrorism against the civilians. And perhaps the Russian government still has a remnant of humanity and will leave the Ukrainians in peace over Christmas at least, and that could perhaps be the start of reasonable, constructive conversations for reaching peace in Ukraine. Thank you very much.
And if you're joining us just now, that was a press conference between German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Both are holding a second day of peace talks here in Berlin. Before a meeting with European leaders, the heads of NATO and the European Commission, Merz talked about positive dynamism in the peace process. Zelenskyy, on the other hand, said there was still work to be done, for example, on the key issue of security guarantees and reparations. He also thanked U.S. negotiators for what he called fact-based talks over the past 2 days. Let's go straight to Ukraine now, where this meeting is, of course, being followed very, very closely. Nick Connolly is standing by for us in Kyiv. Nick, you followed many of these pressers for us over the past years. What stood out to you in this one?
Well, certainly this wasn't very contentious because essentially Zelenskyy and Merz are on the same page. It would have been a very different story if you'd had a representative of Donald Trump's team in the room with them there. I think the most interesting thing was what we just at the end there heard from Merz about basically calling on the Russians to organise some kind of ceasefire over Christmas at least. That is basically the Europeans trying to put the ball back into the Americans and the Russians' court to say, Donald Trump wants this over by Christmas, then let the Russians stop bombing at least civilian infrastructure over the Christmas period. We've seen attempts to do that in the past that have never worked for more than a couple of hours, but it is an attempt to force the Russians to stop firing, to basically maybe even a more generalised ceasefire before the rest is all sorted out. Now, time and time again, the Russians have said, we are not going to do any kind of ceasefire before basically Ukraine capitulates or at least agrees to all our maximalist demands. But this is an attempt by the Europeans, I guess, to call out also to the man in the White House and to say, look, this is about ending the killing. Tell your friends in Russia to stop doing this. They are going to listen to you. Why not push them to do that? So that's the kind of interpretation when you look at Ukrainian social media, how people read those words. There's also an interesting bit from President Zelenskyy, kind of aside, where he said it was very good to have direct contact with Witkoff and Kushner, and then made a kind of slight kind of aside remark saying, well, we could have got a lot further in a lot less time had they talked to me directly before. Because obviously the situation that has been prevalent up till now was that Kushner and Witkoff spoke to the Russians, spoke to the Europeans maybe, but never to the Ukrainians. That was all at a kind of lower, more technical level, and the Ukrainians had General Keith Kellogg, the Ukraine emissary, to talk to, who, as we now understand, does have a lot less weight in Trump world than Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner.
No major announcements at this press conference, but we have seen some movement on the Ukrainian side in Ukraine's position over these past 48 hours. Can you walk us through what changed and what the picture looks like today?
So I think the major potential concession there is NATO membership. Ukraine has wanted to be in NATO for a very long time. It's even in the constitution that is the direction that Ukraine is going into. But we've heard Zelenskyy say, well, if you provide us with legally binding security guarantees from the US, as other countries like Japan or South Korea have that aren't part of NATO, obviously, then that could be an alternative. But that is still a very big ask. That is a lot more than Ukraine has ever got before, and it would need lawmakers in the US to agree to it. Maybe they would ask something similar from the Europeans as well. So it's basically lots of the same guarantees that you would get through NATO, but just without the kind of NATO badge on it. Potentially that is something that allows the Russians to save face and to say, look, we've got this win, but I doubt it'll be enough to convince the Russian side to agree to this. The really big issue that is unresolved is territory. As we understand, the Americans have been pushing the Ukrainians still to withdraw from the bits of Donetsk region, a place like Kramatorsk that they still control. And there's been some kind of talk of a fudge, not quite letting the Russian army roll in, but having maybe a demilitarized zone, some kind of free trade zone. The Russians saying that maybe they would send the police in rather than army. That is not something that people here in Ukraine believe. Firstly, that is an area that is very well defendable compared to open countryside. So if Ukraine leaves that area, it is going to be very vulnerable to attack along the kind of new front lines, as it were. Also, it's a question of trust between political decision makers and the armies. Ukrainian troops have lost thousands of lives protecting that region now since 2014, and it would likely create a political crisis after any kind of ceasefire, with those soldiers asking Zelenskyy why he agreed to this. And I think that is exactly the kind of political crisis that the Russians are hoping to provoke by this. So that is still far from resolved. There is no sense here that Zelenskyy will be allowed to agree to that by Ukrainian public opinion. So maybe lots of kind of less controversial things have been agreed on, but the last couple of inches to a deal will be the most difficult, and most people here are not convinced that it's going to go anywhere.
Exactly. I mean, it's one thing what's being negotiated here. The other is what Russia might agree to. Is there a sense in Ukraine that any deal that is acceptable to Kyiv will be acceptable to Moscow, or will Russia just keep moving its red lines?
That is certainly the fear here in Ukraine. They are not seeing any signals from Moscow that Moscow is in any way willing to move from those maximalist demands that we saw enunciated by Putin before his invasion in 2022. We even had the Russian ambassador to London recently saying in an interview that Ukraine needs to surrender. No talk of a compromise, no talk of a deal, surrender. And there is a sense here that Ukraine right now, and Europe for that matter, has to show engagement, has to thank Trump for his initiatives and for his bringing dynamism to the process, has to be seen to be engaging to avoid then being blamed when it all falls over.
Now, this is, of course, a meeting that is held in Germany, but it very much feels like the shots are being called in Washington. How big is the sense in Kyiv, where you are, that the Europeans really have a say in the outcome of these negotiations?
Obviously, this has all been brought about because the Americans have been negotiating with the Russians, and we've basically had those two negotiators there, Witkoff and Kushner, basically bringing what they are hearing from the Russians to the Europeans and Zelensky there. But I think the Europeans do have a fair amount of leverage. Basically, Ukraine is now being financed exclusively by the Europeans. The US is not giving much, and most of what the US sends is for cash, often European cash. Now, the EU has all those hundreds of billions of euros of frozen Russian central bank assets, which it now is inching closer to actually not just freezing, but also confiscating or immobilizing permanently in a way that allows Europe to give Ukraine a whole lot more cash. Then there's the talk of potential peacekeepers. In the press conference, Zelensky was asked about that, and he slightly swerved, but talked about the need to control and to kind of check, monitor any ceasefire and make sure it's clear who has broken the ceasefire, because obviously that was the main issue after 2014. But potentially we've had several European countries saying that they are willing to consider putting their soldiers in harm's way, as Keir Starmer put it at one point, maybe not exactly along the front lines, somewhere in central Ukraine, but having boots on the ground that would allow Ukraine to free up capacity to actually make sure it's able to defend its borders with Russia and Belarus better than at present. So it does have a lot of things in terms of hard power that it can do that can strengthen Ukraine's hands, its negotiating position. But right now, we are only seeing incremental movement in that direction. The frozen assets taking a long while. We believe it's going to maybe change soon. As for peacekeepers, we're still waiting here. Ukrainians obviously very concerned to see that kind of hard and fast commitment.
This press conference wasn't the end of the talks here in Berlin. President Macron of France is coming tonight for a work dinner. Prime Minister Starmer of the UK, Giorgia Meloni of Italy, the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, and the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is also going to be there. Now, is this just a meeting among friends, or are these talks going to continue? Are they going to seek ways out of discussions that we haven't found a solution yet to, like, for example, the issue of frozen Russian assets in Belgium?
Well, certainly the things that are in their hand to give in terms of European decision-making, in terms of peacekeepers, that is all something that can be discussed there. Obviously, there is a sense that this is at least initially about the pictures, about the visuals for Donald Trump to show once again that Ukraine is not isolated, that this is not just Ukraine being recalcitrant, that this is actually a consolidated European position. And I think it has been clear now for the last couple of months that lots of European leaders increasingly saying that this is not just about Ukraine and its safety, this is about Europe in a wider sense, that if Ukraine were to fall in some sense to some kind of Russian proxy government taking over here in Kyiv, then that frees up Russia to put pressure, maybe in a hybrid sense, maybe in a conventional sense, on other NATO members, on NATO members like the Baltic countries, say, or other European countries. So that is the fear, that right now Ukraine is buying the rest of Europe time to rearm and to prepare for Russia's imperial ambitions in this part of the world. And if Ukraine were to be pressured in some kind of deal and kind of collapses in on itself, then they might be caught earlier than they are, will be ready for. So there is a sense that Ukraine has a lot more support now, and that other European countries are also willing to dig deeper into their pockets to keep Ukraine going, because they are now increasingly aware of the fact that this isn't just about Ukraine, it isn't just about Donbass, it is about a bigger issue.
DW Ukraine correspondent Nick Connolly in Kyiv. Thanks so much, Nick. And Simon Young has been following these talks for us from Berlin. Simon, what was your main takeaway?
Well, I think that what I would focus on is the sort of positive noises coming from Chancellor Merz. He said that there's a large dynamism behind the talks today, and that the chances for peace are real. Now, you might say he would say that, wouldn't he? Because he's the host of these talks. He's the one sort of coordinating them. But I think that there is a sort of enthusiasm from the German perspective to say what we've managed to do here is to be involved and to show that we are driving the momentum in this process now more than has been the case recently. And the evidence of that, perhaps, is the fact that these two leading US negotiators, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, have been here. They have been directly involved in these talks. They're sticking around, we understand, to take part in the dinner later this evening with the European leaders, who are all beginning to arrive now here at the Chancellery in Berlin. And so the talks go on, and the US side also making very positive noises, saying that 90% of what needs to be agreed around the ceasefire is agreed. That's what we're hearing from US sources. Well, who knows whether that's spinning or whether those final details are in fact the most difficult ones, as Nick was suggesting. But nonetheless, the German perspective is certainly that this was a very useful couple of days in Ukraine diplomacy.
A useful couple of days, but is there really a sense that we're any closer to a true deal that could end this war, or at least lead to a ceasefire?
Well, of course, ultimately that will depend on the reaction from Russia. And personally, I haven't seen anything that suggests to me that Russia is in conciliatory mood. The only report we've had this afternoon is that Russia possibly has said that they don't object to European Union membership for Ukraine. Well, that isn't much of a concession. That is not really for them to decide. Yeah. But I think the Europeans have consolidated their support. They've found a platform for diplomacy, and they're talking about really ramping up the pressure.
That's DW Simon Young. Many thanks, Simon. And that's all the news we have for you at this hour. Join me again in about 32 minutes, where we'll have more stories from around the world.
At home, their art is forbidden. Abroad, these women show its true strength. 5 artists of Afghan heritage, each on a different path, yet all holding on to their native tradition and offering the world a gift.
Arts Unveiled. Next.